Alright, let's talk Splunk. Splunk is like Google for your machine data. It lets you search, analyze, and visualize events in real time. Just a little over a year ago, in March 2024, Splunk was officially acquired by Cisco in a $28 billion deal, one of the biggest in cybersecurity history. So today, let us break down Splunk, how it works, and why it's one of the most powerful SIEM tools in the industry. But before we talk Splunk, I would love to quickly go over what a SIEM is. A SIEM stands for Security Incident and Event Management Tool. But before we go starting talking about SIEMs, I would love us to talk about logs and events. Events are basically observable occurrences that happen within an infrastructure or within a system, while logs are a record of events. So any single action that you take and is recorded down is called an event. For example, when you log into a system, it is an event. When you log out of a system, it's an event. When you open a file, when you access a directory, all of these are individual events. While logs are just basically a way of structuring those events. Logs are just basically a record of events. So a log will come off as something as 101, this user signed in. 102, this user accessed these files. 103, this user modified something in this file. 104, this user saved those files. All of them are events in their own, but logs is just basically a way of recording / structuring these events altogether. So SIEMs are basically tools that help manage all of these events being recorded in a system or infrastructure. Back to Splunk. All right. So Splunk actually has two main models. We have Splunk Cloud and Splunk Enterprise. This is very similar to how organizations actually run their infrastructure. If you're working in an organization, there are only two possible ways in which you can run your IT infrastructure. It's either you run it on-prem, in other words, you have all of the servers, all of the wires, all of the devices, you have all of them presently on site. Or you can run a cloud computing model where all of the devices, your networking are being outsourced to something called a cloud service provider. They basically help you host your infrastructure in a remote location, also known as the cloud. Splunk also comes in these two major flavors, Splunk Enterprise and Splunk Cloud. So with Splunk Enterprise, you're basically going to be running your whole Splunk infrastructure, or you're going to be running your whole Splunk networking on premise. In other words, you're going to be hosting the server that will be running your Splunk. You'll also be hosting all of the devices upon which your forwarders are going to be on. Or you can now run the other service model called Splunk Cloud, in which Splunk themselves are actually going to help you to host the server on which your main Splunk enterprise, on which your main Splunk deployment is actually going to run on. So Splunk Enterprise is basically you running your whole Splunk infrastructure on site, on premise, while Splunk Cloud is basically you outsourcing your infrastructure and letting Splunk help you run your main Splunk server in the cloud. All right, let us move on to the components of Splunk. So we have three major components of Splunk. We have the Splunk forwarder, we have the index, and we have the search head. Forwarders are agents that basically sit on your endpoint and they help you to transfer logs from the endpoint to the indexer on your main Splunk server. So think of it as this. You have a main Splunk deployment server that is going to be handling processing, storing, and basically everything that has to do with your logs. But how then do you receive logs? Forwarders. Each forwarder is going to sit on every endpoint and they are going to help you to transfer all of those logs from your endpoints to your main Splunk deployment server or to your indexer. So what is an indexer, you may ask me? An indexer is basically the engine of Splunk that receives logs from the forwarder and also helps to process them as well as store them in an index after they have been processed. So forwarder sends logs to Splunk. Splunk sends logs to the indexer. The indexer is a component of Splunk that helps you to process and parse all of your logs and helps you to arrange them. The indexer also sends them to something called an index. An index is basically a database that helps to store your already processed logs. That is what an index is. The final component of Splunk is a search head. Search heads are basically the platform that helps you to query and search for your events. They help you to query and search for your logs. Forwarders send data. Indexers processes the data, and index stores the data, while a search head is the platform that actually allows you to search for your data within the index. All right. Okay, so let us quickly jump into the Splunk data pipeline. The Splunk data pipeline is basically a model that helps us to visualize how data flows through the whole Splunking process. So everything starts from data input. Like I mentioned earlier, forwarders. Basically, forwarders, the agents that sit on your endpoint, and then they help you to transfer data to be processed. So it all starts from input, data input through your forwarders. So that is the first stage of the Splunk data pipeline. The next stage is parsing. Parsing is basically the process of processing these raw events. Remember, your forwarder sends your events or your logs in a very raw format, meaning it is going to be highly unreadable, it's going to be highly unstructured. So during the process of parsing, all of your events and logs are now going to be processed. They are going to be worked on, they are going to be structured, they are going to have timestamps attached to them, and they are going to be in a format that can be more easily interpreted by you, the analyst. So the whole process of parsing is being done by the indexer. The next stage in the Splunk data pipeline is indexing, and this is the point whereby after your data or your logs have been processed, you can basically send them to something called an index. Like I said earlier, an index is basically a database that helps you store your already processed data. The final part of the Splunk data pipeline is the search part, and this is usually covered by the search head. In this area, the analysts, the end users, they can interact with the already processed data. They can visualize events, they can query for data, they can search for data, they can start to use the already processed data in their day-to-day activities. All right, the next thing I would love to talk about is going to be Splunk licensing. Before I jump into Splunk D, I would love to quickly cover Splunk licensing. So, how does Splunk allow users to use their products? It is something basically called the Splunk license. So, how does Splunk charge? Splunk basically charges you based on the number of data or the amount of data that you ingest per day. So let's say you are a small company and the amount of logs, the amount of events that flow through your data every single day is 500 gigabytes. Splunk is going to give you a license that charges you a total of only 500 gigabytes a day. So in one single day, your Splunk license is going to cover you for only 500 gigabytes of data to be transferred, to be processed, to be stored. Anything above that, some certain functions of Splunk might be withheld, you will receive a warning, and then there will be certain functions of Splunk that you would not be able to access. Alright, that is how Splunk makes their money. They charge you with a license. A license are being charged based on the amount of data that you are ingesting in a single day. The final part of Splunk that I'm going to be covering is called Splunk D. Splunk D basically starts for Splunk daemon, and it is basically the process behind everything Splunk. As you know, processes on computers are like background services that are running to ensure that everything within your system is working properly. Splunk D or the Splunk daemon is the background process that ensures everything from forwarders to indexers to even the search heads are properly running. Splunk is a very interesting tool, and it is one which I believe a lot of us will get to enjoy. Beyond the basics, Splunk is actually more than just log management. It is more than a SIEM tool. With Splunk apps and add-ons such as the AWS, the Microsoft 365, the Palo Alto and firewalls, you can get a lot more from Splunk. They basically give you a lot more, you can think of them as more like a toolkit that helps to extend the range of services that Splunk offers. With machine learning toolkit, MTLK, you can also use AI and machine learning within Splunk to help with anomaly detection and also predictive analytics. They can also help you spot patterns that you will not catch normally. As you know, if you're using Splunk, you're definitely or most probably going to be filtering through hundreds of thousands of logs. So with the machine learning toolkit, they can help you to use AI and machine learning for more advanced services. And Splunk is actually not only for security. Splunk is not limited to only cybersecurity. Remember, it is a SIEM tool. It is also used in IT operations to help them monitor their uptime. In DevOps troubleshooting, they can use it to monitor their uptime. In business analytics, it can also be used to visualize and help. It can also be used to visualize customers' data, or it can also be used to visualize data. Splunk is multifaceted. Splunk is talented. So, to recap, Splunk is an industry-leading SIEM now backed by Cisco. It helps ingest events and logs, processes them through forwarders, indexers, and search threads, and gives us the power to search, analyze, and visualize data at scale. Whether you're in security, IT ops, DevOps, Splunk helps you turn machine data into answers. If you've never tried Splunk, I recommend you start with the free version of Splunk. You can also start, I think Splunk Enterprise has a free trial, and Splunk Cloud also has a free trial. You can just try to run a few SQL queries and start to actually see Splunk in action.